The hard fork for November of this year is kind of the first one where there's some pretty serious disagreement between the two camps, Bitcoin ABC and Bitcoin Unlimited. But then you have Craig Wright disagree with both of them. He has patents on something similar, so he doesn't want it in the blockchain because he can't charge people licensing fees to use his proprietary, patented.
Are you serious?
Product. Yeah. It seems like he's had a falling out with just about every single person in the Bitcoin technical community.
Internet relay, chat. I got a load of MSR dumps that I flow.
Hi everyone, I'm really happy to have Chris Pacey with me here today to talk about Bitcoin Cash. We all know that there has been a lot of tension within the Bitcoin Cash ranks at the moment, and there's a hard fork planned for November. So I wanted to invite him on so we can talk about what's going on with Bitcoin Cash and where everyone stands. There are multiple camps who believe that there are different paths forward for Bitcoin Cash, and they debate about what the best path forward is. So thank you so much for being on the show, Chris, and for chatting with me about this topic.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start off with a bit of background. So hard fork is planned for November. How did this come about?
Yeah, so, I think if we look at the cryptocurrency developers as a whole, I think most cryptocurrency developers, with the exception of the Bitcoin core developers, would argue that if a coin wants to, innovate, remain competitive, scale, this sort of stuff, you're going to have to do hard forks from time to time. And I think it's really just the Bitcoin core developers and their supporters who are very anti-hard fork. It's like pretty much everyone else would tell you, hard forks are kind of a fact of life for cryptocurrency. And so much so that even back when Gavin Andreessen was the lead developer or lead maintainer for what's now Bitcoin Core, and Mike Hearn was working on the project and other people, there was a serious proposal to do hard forks once a year, just so that because the belief is Bitcoin was not perfect when it came out in 2009. So there's going to need to be things that need to be improved of, particularly in the realm of scaling. So when Bitcoin Cash, they forked off in August of last year. That was when the chain was kind of born. And the agreement among developers at the time, and these were developers among at least two different software implementations of Bitcoin Cash. So you have the Bitcoin ABC developers. There's a software implementation called Bitcoin ABC that implements the Bitcoin Cash protocol. The ABC developers include Amaury Séchet, who he's pretty much the one who started Bitcoin Cash. It was kind of his idea to let's just fork off and do it. So ABC has been kind of the main implementation, and they've had about 2/3 to about maybe 60% market share for the Bitcoin node software, people running their software. The other main implementation has been Bitcoin Unlimited, which has about maybe 1/3 to 40% market share of the Bitcoin Cash full nodes. And then there are some smaller implementations like Bitcoin XT, and then Purse has one. There's a couple others.
Who are some of the people involved in Bitcoin Unlimited?
Andrew Stone, Andrea Susani, Peter Risen, Amini. There's, I want to say maybe 5 or 6 people. Yeah.
Okay.
So there's been these two main Bitcoin implementations. So there was agreement among both ABC and Unlimited at the time that Bitcoin Cash was created, that they would do semi-annual hard forks, right? And this is a pretty aggressive hard fork schedule, probably the most aggressive I've seen. But the idea was Bitcoin Cash is still very small. Let's kind of get the hard forks out of the way early on, while there's agreement and consensus, because it's going to be a lot harder if it ever gets bigger. It's going to be harder to get consensus to do this sort of stuff.
And so why did they have a pre-scheduled fork number? Is it because they have changes they couldn't all be implemented at once, that they needed to spread them out?
Yeah, you don't want to bundle too much together at one time, because it can be dangerous from a code perspective. You could have introducing a lot of bugs. But also it takes time to write the code for the stuff and plan and spec everything out. So yeah, it's kind of spread out over multiple forks. So there was a hard fork last year, in November of last year, another one in May of this year. And both of those were not, I would say, not without controversy. There were definitely like differences of opinion and what have you, but I guess at the end of the day, everyone kind of like agreed, and the hard fork kind of went off without a hitch. But this is the hard fork for November of this year is kind of the first one where there's some pretty serious disagreement between the two camps. So there's disagreement between Bitcoin ABC and Bitcoin Unlimited on this. So that's kind of like one dynamic between these two groups. But then you have Craig Wright and his company nChain disagree with like both of them, right? Like so Craig, who by the way doesn't write any code, they haven't written any code, they haven't produced any products, all they've done is just file 1 million patents. nChain has just kind of been like very, in particular Craig Wright has just been like very disruptive. So he's like anti Bitcoin ABC, he's anti Bitcoin Unlimited. He's been going around like blocking everyone under the sun, on Twitter. I was recently blocked on Twitter. So it seems like he's like had a falling out with just about every single person in the Bitcoin technical community over this hard fork. And then as a result, like he's like claiming he just wants to like fork off and create his own version of Bitcoin Cash that they're calling Bitcoin SV, I guess allegedly for Satoshi's vision. And so they're trying to, he thinks that Bitcoin SV is going to completely overtake Bitcoin Cash, and his version is going to become the new Bitcoin Cash, right?
So does he see it overtaking Bitcoin in general?
Well, I mean, if you talk to him, that's what he would say as well. But Bitcoin Cash hasn't taken over Bitcoin SV or Bitcoin Core, so I wouldn't expect the Bitcoin SV to either. But so, and we can go into, if you want to go into, we can talk about the specific changes that are like creating controversy.
Yes, let's talk about all the different versions that are being proposed at the moment.
I guess maybe we could start with what Bitcoin ABC developers are proposing. So I think there's maybe 3 or 4 different changes, but 2 of them are really minor and 2 of them are kind of major. The minor ones, there's not any disagreement on, but the 2 are, one is a new opcode called opcheck datasig, and the other one is something called canonical transaction ordering. So let's start with the opcheck datasig opcode. This was originally proposed by Bitcoin Unlimited, and they were hoping to get it into the hard fork in May, which was part of the controversy from May that hard fork, that opcode did not get in May. And part of it was ABC, while they didn't agree with like they agreed with the spirit of what the opcode was trying to do, they didn't like the specification. And so they spent the next number of months like hammering out a new specification and getting agreement on it. It's a relatively simple opcode. So all it does is it allows you to verify a signature on like an arbitrary piece of data. So currently in Bitcoin, you can only verify the signature on the transaction and not just any old signature. And so what you could do with this is it could potentially add some extra functionality into the chain where you could do something like, maybe Alice and Bob want to put money into a Bitcoin address where it pays out to either one of them based on, let's say, like the spot price of gold 6 months from now, right? In order to do that, you need to get the spot price of gold into the blockchain somehow. And there's no way to do that in Bitcoin currently. But with a ability to verify like a signature on a random piece of data, you could have some kind of trusted third party could just like, he could sign the spot price of gold like every hour, let's say, and just publish it on his web page. And then Alice and Bob could just copy and paste it from the web page and stick that signature in their transaction and then validate it that way. So there's some interesting things you can do with that. It's a little unfortunate. It requires, like a third party oracle, we call it, to do this, but it is adding like new functionality. And it's not really controversial at all. I don't think there's anyone, certainly nobody in the technical community on Bitcoin Cash who opposes it, but it's opposed by Craig Wright. And for like the worst possible reason too. It's because he has patents on something similar. So he doesn't want it in the blockchain, because if it gets in the blockchain, then he can't like charge people licensing fees to use his proprietary, you know, patented.
Are you serious?
product. Yeah, yeah.
So
And he's like
the
open about
supposed creator of Bitcoin is now a patent troll who wants to charge people for this original open source platform that was released to the world to help it become more free and to be an option.
Yeah, so he's like that's like his only reason for opposing it, apparently. And they've made some claims about like people might use this for gambling, and I don't know. So is he like? They don't strike me as being anti-gambling because
so
like
anti-gambling. They want the stake to control people's choices, and this gets better and better. Here's to Satoshi, guys. Now, what I don't understand, like when you have proponents of Craig Wright as being Satoshi Nakamoto, and you have this core group of people who are just so pro him, you have to wonder, like, what is their background in Bitcoin? Do they understand what Bitcoin is for and why it's important? Like, why are they involved? Because it just seems that currently Craig is anti everything that Bitcoin stands for at this stage.
Yeah, I mean, his like, he has a very like weird view of Bitcoin. Like you know, I used to think Craig had like very libertarian leanings, but now it doesn't seem like, the more things he's saying, it doesn't seem like that. Like I just read right before we got on the call, he said like Ross Ulbricht got what he deserved, and like
oh my God, are you serious?
yeah.
Guys, Craig Wright should not be a real thing. I'm going to come out and say it right now. You guys should not be supporting him. Let's just get that out of the way right now.
Yeah. Oh. So yeah, I know. So he just has this like, I mean, his vision for Bitcoin doesn't seem to be like what ours is. Like, I don't know what his view seems to be like, he has some vague notion that like having more than one miner is good for some reason, but like he doesn't seem to think that like however many happen to like miners we happen to have, even if it's only like 2 or 3 or 5 or something like this, that's fine. Like competition will like magically prevent any nefarious activity from going on. And he's like not worried about like governments controlling miners or censoring miners. He insists that like the system is like perfect, right? And so like anyone who has like concerns about like, well, maybe we have some issues with mining centralization, or, you know, maybe there's some you know, we want to preserve censorship resistance. Like he just said, nope, the system's perfect. It'll work. And doesn't really provide any explanation for why that is.
So it seems very problematic if he's just resting on like, my word is the word of Satoshi. Do not question me. So so he's opposing these changes. And then there's also disagreement within the other camps as well. So it's not just Craig Wright versus everyone else. What are some of the contentious issues among
so like I said, Bitcoin Unlimited and Bitcoin ABC, they agree on the new opcode, the check data sig. But they disagree on an ABC proposal for something called canonical transaction ordering. So right now, the way transactions are ordered in the block, there's a consensus rule that says basically transactions can be in any order in the block, except if one transaction spends from another one, that the spend has to come after the one it spends from. That's the only rule. And it's kind of interesting that that's the current consensus rule, because there's no actual code validating this in the actual code base. Instead, it's a result of just simply how the transactions are validated. The software just starts at the first transaction in the block, validates it, then moves on to the next one, then moves on to the next one. And so it ends up kind of creating an implied consensus rule that way. But ABC is arguing that by doing it that way, it puts an extra burden on nodes to that want to try to like parallelize transaction validation. So this goes back to scaling. The idea is that, you know, the software, and I tend to agree with this, that, you know, Bitcoin is capable of scaling, maybe not to like giant scales and unlimited levels, but it does have some reasonable scaling properties. Like you can at least get PayPal level, maybe even up to like Visa level, but not with like the current software architecture, right? The software architecture needs to change. And one of those things is the software currently only really makes use of a single CPU core at a time, right? So most of our computers, my computer I'm talking to you on, your computer, they have multiple CPU cores, but the software was built really to only use one, right? And part of that is because it's just a lot easier to write software that only uses a single core, and maybe you could say safer to do so too, because writing multi-threaded software and that does a lot of things in parallel has the potential to introduce a lot of bugs, and it can be really difficult to write like good software that parallelizes a lot of stuff. But that means that that single core is a bottleneck for scaling. And so if you wanted to process more transactions, you're going to need to spread the work across multiple CPU cores. And this is what ABC is trying to do. And they're arguing that the current ordering of the transaction in the block is a little bit of a burden to spreading the transactions validation across multiple cores. And so they want to change the order of transactions in the block. Well, first off, I would say they would argue that just simply removing the ordering requirement altogether would make it easier to parallelize transaction validation. But they're arguing that since you're already kind of removing the ordering, it might make sense to introduce a new ordering where you order it by transaction ID, like lowest to highest. And that provides some additional benefits. Like you can do like set reconciliation on block propagation, so you can compress the blocks a lot smaller when you transmit them. You can do things like exclusion proofs and this sort of stuff. So they argue that there's some like ancillary benefits to doing the canonical transaction ordering. And the Bitcoin Unlimited developers, I wouldn't say, they don't seem like, my reading of it is they're not like 100% opposed to it, but their view is more like, we haven't had enough time to think about this and to analyze it and to study it and come to an informed opinion. And so they feel like it's a little too rushed, is their argument. And so like the Unlimited developers would like to see it held off on and not go into November. And the ABC developers are kind of like, well, we already wrote the code, we already released it, so it's going in November. And I think there is something to be said, like if you do postpone it another, let's say 6 months, I'm not sure a whole lot's going to happen in that 6-month period that would change anyone's mind either. But that's the dispute between Unlimited and ABC over this canonical transaction ordering.
Right, and there are different block sizes for different camps, correct?
Yeah, so both ABC and Unlimited are okay keeping the block size at its current level at 32 megabytes. It's still the block size limit. It's Craig Wright wants to increase it. Well, really, he wants to remove the block size limit entirely. But his I guess their official proposal is to increase it to 128 megabytes now, and then like 512 next year, and then I think maybe the year after that completely remove it.
You've found this to be very problematic.
The Bitcoin Unlimited developers did do a lot of research on this. They created a test net for the purpose of trying to see what's like the maximum throughput the network can handle. And their findings found, so they hit a initial bottleneck at around 100 transactions a second, which works out to roughly like 22 to 25 megabyte blocks, somewhere in that neighborhood range. And the bottleneck is not due to like the hardware limitations, right? It's not like my laptop's not capable of processing that amount. The bottleneck is due to the software design, as I was mentioning before. So the software is just very inefficiently designed, right? And the issue was, again, it was as transactions were coming in, it's only validating them on a single CPU core, and it just couldn't process, that single core just couldn't process more than that amount. So Andrew Stone did some preliminary work on this particular testnet. He patched the code to distribute the work over multiple cores. This is mempool validation, it's called. And with that one optimization, which by the way hasn't been deployed in any production software yet, it's still kind of like very early code. But with that one optimization, they were able to ramp the block size up to about around 100 megabytes or so before they hit another bottleneck. Again, a software-related bottleneck, not really a hardware-related one. But this bottleneck more or less kind of crashed the network because it the nodes couldn't validate blocks within that 10-minute window, I think was the issue. So it was like they just couldn't keep up with the blockchain.
So, what research has Craig Wright's faction done into this that they think that 128 megabytes is okay?
No, they have nothing. And see, what's amazing is like Craig is telling people like, you just need to spend more money. You just need a more expensive computer. He's like, this is capitalism. If you can't, you just got to spend the money and you can't compete. But here's the thing, that's not even right technically, because the problem, if you buy a more expensive computer, what happens is like CPU cores don't get that much faster when you spend more money. Instead, what happens when you buy a more expensive computer is you get more cores, okay? But the software won't use those additional cores because it's only designed to use like a single core. So you can't just simply buy more expensive hardware and call it a day like he's saying you can do. And so this is precisely why like the Bitcoin ABC developers want like the change the transaction ordering is to spread the work across multiple cores. And so like, I mean, not only like Craig Wright's suggesting that works like not necessary, and he's also just suggesting you can just jack up the the block size with like no consequences. And so and the same thing with like the Bitcoin Unlimited developers agree too with this, that the software right now, the biggest bottleneck to scaling right now is the software, not hardware. And you have to improve the software, and both sides, Unlimited and ABC, are trying to improve the software in order to get the system to scale. And like their view is like, we'll increase the block size beyond 32 megabytes, but only once the software is in a position to handle it, right? It's not in a position to handle it today.
Right.
And like he's just insisting like it needs to be increased today. Mm-hmm. And it also doesn't make sense when you consider that the Bitcoin Cash is currently only using like 0.1% of its total block size.
It's like, why? What problem is he currently solving? Like, and it also seems like he's just very confused about like his underlying philosophy. If he's like, hey, 128 because of capitalism. Also, I'd like a government enforced monopoly on this technology, which is why I'm becoming a patent troll. It's like, choose one or the other. Like, so you stop doing this rent seeking and cherry picking which side you want to be on. So you've had a lot of community members who are not part of Bitcoin Cash talking about this, weighing in. I'm not sure if Bitcoin Core has talked about this. Any of the core developers have spoken up. I know Vitalik has said, listen, you should just let Bitcoin Cash split apart. Like the sooner you can ostracize Craig Wright, the better for the Bitcoin Cash community, which is kind of a good point. But I wonder if the fracturing of the Bitcoin Cash community could be problematic.
I mean, it could be, but it seems to me, the first part of the question, I haven't really seen much from the core side. I don't follow them like that much anymore, but like, I haven't seen them really like weigh in that much on it. But other than like Greg Maxwell, who's one of the core developers, he like reviewed some of the code that nChain put out for their Bitcoin SV, and I think he found some issues with it or something, which is not surprising. But I would worry a little bit about, I mean, there definitely is a fracture in the community, but I think the vast majority, if I had to guess, I'd probably say 70 to 80% are siding with like both ABC and Unlimited against like nChain. Like nChain really seems like they're increasingly in a smaller minority, and they're alienating themselves more and more in the community. Like even like, I think like Roger Ver was recently like blocked by Craig Wright, I think. And like Roger was like kind of like a big holdout, like one of like the last ones still kind of like endorsing.
That always like blew my mind as well. Like why on earth was Roger Ver interested in supporting Craig Wright at all? Like he should have just spoken out against Craig Wright from the start.
Yeah, I mean, as far as Craig goes, I mean, there is, I don't want to say like, I mean, I wouldn't take a position one way or the other, but there is like some amount of evidence that suggests he may have been involved with Bitcoin. Not that he's like the Satoshi Nakamoto or whatever, but I think he likes people thinking he's like the Satoshi Nakamoto.
It's a complicated issue, and no one knows the identity of Satoshi, but looking at the philosophy that Satoshi seemed to support and why he was creating this money in the first place, it just seems completely antithetical to what Craig Wright stands for.
Yeah. Which certainly could be explained if there were like multiple people working on it, and Craig was just one of them. I don't want to say that that's exactly what happened. I don't know.
Do you agree with Vitalik when he says that the community should fracture and Craig shouldn't really be involved?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be better at this point if they just created their Bitcoin SV and put it out there, and just let the Bitcoin Cash continue on the way it was. I don't think many people in the Bitcoin Cash community would follow it. I think most even people who are vocally supporting Bitcoin SV today, I think would probably still use and support Bitcoin Cash, you know, if they realize that SV is like, let's say, worth 1/10 of what Bitcoin Cash is or something like that. What Craig is like hoping for, and see, this is maybe like the wild card in the scenario, that both him and he has this billionaire buddy, Calvin Ayre, who Calvin just kind of does whatever Craig tells him to do. Calvin has a bunch of hash mining equipment, and he has I don't know, 30-40% of the Bitcoin Cash hash rate. And I think nChain might be buying mining equipment too and mining some. And so they're saying that they're going to take all their hash rate and put it on Bitcoin SV. And they actually, it seems like they think they're going to be able to get like a majority of the hash rate and mine Bitcoin SV. And this is one of like, I think the fallacies that Craig Wright has been pushing, that unfortunately I think a lot of the Bitcoin Cash community bought into, is the idea that like the miners dictate to the network like what the protocol is, and like the users are just like at the slaves to the miners. In the reality, it's the other way around, that users determine what's profitable to mine, and then the miners, you know, they mine whatever's most profitable. And so like they're kind of under the impression like nChain is like, if as long as they can get like a majority hashing power, that they're going to be like the new Bitcoin Cash, and that the other Bitcoin Cash would be like a fork and would just kind of whittle away because they've got all this hashing power. But it depends on what the market perceives. Like if Bitcoin Cash continues being valued at like $600, you know, per coin, and let's say the SV coin is valued at like $60 per coin, then even if they take like half the hashing power away from Bitcoin Cash and mine Bitcoin SV with it, then what that means is all of a sudden Bitcoin Cash just becomes incredibly profitable to mine, right? So you might see some core miners might switch over and start mining Bitcoin Cash. And then the SV miners, basically nChain and Craig, are going to be stuck mining at a big loss at that point, right? So it's like, how long can they mine at a loss for, right? So it basically, you have to have, the hashing power is always going to go where the price is, no matter what. So, you know, they can try and say, we're just going to take all this hashing power and mine SV, but that doesn't mean like, you can't dictate to the market how they value your coin. And they seem to think that they can. But that's interesting in the sense that they're at least willing to try to do that, right? So it'll be interesting to see what happens with that. My suspicion would be that's probably not going to work, but I mean, they think like they might be able to influence the market if they take a bunch of hash rate with them, but I'm kind of skeptical of that.
Right.
Also, like, who wants to use a coin where it's only mined by nChain and CoinGeek, right? Like, you know, those two companies, like you have two miners and they control 100% of the hash rate. Like, I mean, you might as well just build the centralized digital currency at that point. You know?
Yeah, right. And so what do you think is going to happen? Now we've got the hard fork in November, you've got all of this fracturing in the community. What's the most likely outcome?
Well, so the Bitcoin Unlimited developers have said they're going to implement ABC's protocol changes, but they're going to make them optional. So like when you start up the software, you can decide whether you want to run it with the ABC rule set or not. I think that that's probably good enough to kind of keep unlimited users and ABC users kind of together. And so if I had to speculate at this point, I would seem to think that the ABC hard fork is that contains the data sig and the canonical transaction ordering. I think that probably will go through at this point, unless there's some kind of grand compromise. Now, there was a big meeting in Bangkok a few days ago where they were trying to like come up with a big compromise, and nothing came out of it. From what
they haven't worked too well in the past, but you have the Hong Kong agreement and the New York agreement, and people are always saying, yeah, we're on this side, and I mean, there's no guarantee.
Yeah, I mean, and like Craig Wright, like apparently I was told he like stormed out and said, like lies and bullshit, and like just stormed out and refused to listen to anybody. So
that's so unlike him. That's very out of character.
I know. If I had to place money on it, I think that's probably the outcome I would think. Craig Wright seems like hell-bent on forking off. So I would think that probably will happen too. But I mean, things could change. Like there could be a compromise. I don't know, maybe the ABC developers relent and say, okay, we'll delay the activation of the canonical transaction ordering. It doesn't seem likely at this point, but you never know. But I don't really see, I mean, given Craig Wright's ego, I don't see him relenting and giving into the rule set that ABC is proposing, the data sig and the canonical transaction ordering. I'll also say, I think one thing that goes against Craig Wright and Bitcoin SV is, I think there's a very strong like incumbency bias in the market. I think that this is part of the reason why Bitcoin Core continued to like do so well after the fork, despite the fact that I tend to think like Bitcoin Cash may have, had like a better roadmap. But I think like people just value like, there's some value in being the incumbent. I mean, if you keep the ticker symbol, like the incumbent keeps the ticker symbol, the incumbent, at least their coin was already working. The new one's unproven. And so Craig, that's it. So that's another thing. Like Craig Wright is like, he wants to like try and take the name, but like, I don't think that's probably going to happen. Yeah.
The name. Not again. Come on, guys. Just, if you're going to fork, just get a good name. Really. Sunk cost fallacy. Let that go.
Yeah. Oh, and another thing Craig Wright is hell-bent against is adding replay protection to his fork. So replay protection is where, if there's a fork, the problem is like, if you, let's say Bitcoin Cash and Bitcoin SV, both, they fork off. If you make a transaction on the Bitcoin Cash chain, it's possible that your coins on the Bitcoin SV chain will move automatically, even though you didn't make a Bitcoin SV transaction, and vice versa. So if you make a transaction on the Bitcoin SV chain, it might move your Bitcoin Cash coins without you doing anything. That's called a replay attack. So when Bitcoin Cash forked off from Bitcoin, they tweaked the code slightly so that Bitcoin Cash transactions would be invalid on the Bitcoin chain, and Bitcoin transactions would be invalid on the Bitcoin Cash chain to prevent that type of replay attack from happening. So it's kind of like being a good community member. Craig Wright's insisting that replay protection is like BS, and he's like, there's not going to be any replay protection. Like he's like dead set against it. And I think his reasoning is like, he thinks if you add replay protection, you're kind of conceding that you're the fork, and you're not like the true Bitcoin Cash if he adds the replay protection. So he's like hell-bent on not adding it. So if Bitcoin SV does fork off and you end up like Bitcoin Cash holders would end up with coins on both chains, but it's going to be real problematic trying to sell those coins on the Bitcoin SV chain because it's going to possibly endanger your Bitcoin Cash holdings.
So does that mean that he's basically forcing the hand of the holders to choose? Like you're either using this one or this one. I mean, it doesn't seem like that's going to work in his favor.
Yeah, I don't think so either. But yeah, so moving your coins could potentially be dangerous if they don't add replay protection. I think from my perspective, I didn't really give my perspective other than, I think the increase in the block size proposed by Craig Wright is like way too premature. And I think the approach of both Unlimited and ABC, where they're trying to optimize the software first before, increasing the block size, is the right way to go. As far as like the canonical transaction ordering, I'm mostly in favor of it. I've yet to see any kind of like anyone talk about any downsides. I do agree that, so this has been talked about, Amaury proposed this like back in like over a year ago. It was originally proposed, but people didn't start taking a deep look at it until recently. And at the time it was proposed, it seemed to make sense to me. It still seems to make sense now, but like people are only just starting to talk about it. And this is why they kind of feel like it's too rushed. I could see that sentiment, but I still think like at the end of the day, it's probably a worthy change to make. That's kind of my view.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for chatting with me. This has been immensely helpful in knowing where everything stands. It's a super complex topic, as I said. Yeah. So it's good to just get some insight from someone in the community such as yourself, lead backend developer for OpenBazaar. So thank you so much for sharing your insight.
All right, thank you.
If you like my channel, please hit the like button and be sure to subscribe. I also have a Patreon account and wanted to give a special shout out to all the awesome people there. And a huge thank you to the sponsors of the show for making these videos possible. Thanks so much for watching.
She used to just party, go all the way.